Hi, welcome back to Cosmic and Body Horror. If you enjoy my content, please consider hitting the like button. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm notices me. Something from Above by Donald Wandrei. First published Weird Tales, December 1930. The Red Snow. In themselves, the events had all the horror of a nightmare, but a nightmare can be rationalized so that it ceases to oppress one's mind. The incidents at Norton in western Minnesota were different, for now they may never be completely explained. It is not the things we know that terrify us so much as the things we do not know, the things that break all known laws and rules, the things that creep upon us unawares and shatter the pleasant dream of our little world. The occurrence at Norton was of such a kind, of so appalling and incredible a nature that no one connected with it will ever be able to forget the day of madness. From hysterical or imperfect accounts, an effort has been made to extract probable truth, and in the following story, everything that might have any bearing on the explanation is included. It may be that some things have not yet come to light, or that extraneous details which really do not justify retention have been preserved, or that the incidents have not been recorded in their correct order. If anyone possesses further information, the narrative will gladly be corrected, for anything that may help explain will be eagerly welcomed by scientists and public alike. We walk in darkness with phantoms and specters we know not of, and our uncomprehended world plunges blindly through abysses toward a goal of which we have no conception. That thought is itself a blow to our understanding. We used to comfort ourselves by thinking that we knew all about our own planet at least. But now it is different. The old security exists no longer, and we wonder if we really know anything, or if there can be safety and peace anywhere in the whole universe. The story begins, then, with an amateur astronomer in Pasadena, California. According to a note that he sent to the Mount Wilson Observatory, he was idly examining the planet Saturn on the night of March 28. The atmosphere was exceptionally clear, the observation perfect. The rings were so plain, the visibility so good, and the planet so impressive in its peculiar way that he lingered on surveying it minute after minute. And thus it was that the queer thing happened even while he watched. Shortly after 1 o'clock, there appeared on its surface a spot of such blinding, dazzling radiance that it was like a needle to his eye. He turned away, and not till several minutes had passed, and his sight became normal, did he return to his scrutiny. Another odd variation had taken place in the meantime. Where the spot of incandescent brilliance had been, was now a supplanting dot of blackness. He followed it for half an hour, saw it grow lighter and lighter, become like the rest of the surface. At 1:45, the planet had reassumed its customary appearance. He examined it again on succeeding nights, but noticed nothing unusual in its aspect. He might have ignored the matter altogether if he had not had sufficient scientific training to realize how important was the first principle of never overlooking any fact or datum. Thus it was that he wrote a summary of his observation and duly sent it in. The next incident that must have some bearing on the story is the blotting out of the stars. It was recorded by 3 astronomers, Professor Grill of Harvard, his assistant, Mr. Thorndike, and that same amateur in California, Mr. Nelson. A disturbing feature of the observation is that the 2 Easterners were confident the blotting out occurred far down on the western horizon, whereas Mr. Nelson asserted that it took place in the region of Saturn. Are we to believe that one report was inaccurate if not fictitious, or that there actually were 2 simultaneous phenomena in widely separated parts of the heavens? In the light of after events, the latter seems more likely. At the time, the phenomenon itself, though interesting, did not suggest danger. It was considered almost trivial because it could be argued out of existence so easily as a deception resulting from unfavorable atmospheric conditions, instrumental flaws, or eye strain. Mr. Nelson, in the act of training his telescope on Saturn the evening of March 29, a day after the radiant spot had appeared and vanished, suddenly noticed a star flicker out and reappear, another die, and come to life again. He thought at first that he was the victim of an optical illusion, but he continued observing and saw that the stars were blotted out in a straight line, and the line traveled in the approximate direction of Earth. It was a curious astronomicalism to watch, according to Nelson. It was just as if a man strolling down a street at noon had stopped to look at a diamond on a black plush cushion in a jeweler's window, and then all at once the diamond was no longer there, even while he peered at it, and then suddenly there the diamond was again, sparkling as ever. It did not seem as if a solid body had come between him and the diamond, but rather as though something invisible had crossed the field of vision, something that could not be seen but that intercepted light rays. And so it was with the stars. The report of the two Harvard astronomers duplicated Nelson's, but they said that the blotting out took place far down on the western horizon. Odder still was their statement that the obscured stars were in alignment, and a prolongation of the line would bring it to end in the neighborhood of Earth. No particular attention was paid to these unusual happenings. Even the three sky hunters did not have much more than interested curiosity. And for that reason, because everyone was unprepared, the terror at Norton stalked out of night like a hideous dream, as overwhelming as madness itself. Perhaps it would be better to tell the rest of the affair through the eyes of Lars Loberg, a stolid Norwegian farmer living 3 miles or so outside the town of Norton. For it was around his farm that the disaster centered, and he himself was a first-hand witness until he found merciful relief. He arose early as usual on the morning of March 31. It was cold in the farmhouse, and he stepped outside to chop an armful of kindling. It had already become light when he opened the door, but snow was falling. He went out briskly. Then he halted just beyond the threshold and looked around him with a blank expression on his face. He carefully retraced his steps to the room he had left a moment before and stood there looking across the farmyard and prairies. Helga. He called to his wife, a strained, untypical inflection in his voice. Come here. His wife came, and the two stood in the doorway looking at a natural phenomenon such as they had never before seen. The whole air seemed to be oozing blood. Not a breath of wind was stirring. Not a cloud appeared to be in the sky, but a fine mist was falling. Mist that was neither snow, nor dust, nor blood, but that had something of all three. Around the farmhouse, the snowdrifts that were not yet fully melted in spring thaws had become covered with a mantle of brownish red, and minute by minute, as the strange stuff kept falling from the sky, the layer on the ground grew thicker until everything was blanketed with soggy flakes. The two of them stood there in the quiet of dawn with awe and a trace of fear, looking at the unusual downfall and a world that was bloody red. There was a curious odor in the air, almost a stench. It reminded Lars of a 2 days dead cat he once had stumbled across, and of a pig he had bled to death recently. Lars outstretched his arm and caught some of the falling, flaky drops in his palm. See, he said simply to Helga. The stuff melted. It did not run off like water. It remained in little oily globules of a color like old blood. Instead of the fresh, earthy odor of snow or rain, it gave off an unpleasant smell that offensively suggested something dead. Helga, who was superstitious, shivered and drew back from the extended palm of Lars. Red snow, she said uneasily. It ain't natural. I don't like it. Oh, Lars, shut the door. Her husband somberly looked outside for another minute. Yeah, red snow. Maybe it means a bad year for the crops. Then he shrugged his shoulders and half smiled at Helga. But it's probably only dust in the air that got mixed up with the snow. Nothing to get scared about. And, listen. Helga broke in sharply. Lars interrupted what he was saying. An uproar of grunting and mad squealing such as he had never before heard drifted up to the house from the pigsty. In the barn, the horses were neighing and whinnying shrilly, and he heard the wild clatter of trampling hooves. Above the racket of the frightened animals, he heard the mournful, whimpering howl of Jerry the Scotch collie. Lars tore out of the house on a run. You stay here, he shouted back as Helga started to follow him. I'll see what's the matter and quiet him down. The red snow was still falling. Lars raced over to the barn first, but there were no tracks of any prowler around it in the new fallen snow. nor could he find any evidence that man or beast had been near the pigpen. He hurried back to the barn, slid open the door, and did his best to quiet the plunging horses. Something had badly scared them, but he could not imagine what it was. For the first time in his experience, they paid hardly any attention to his efforts at calming them, and he became more puzzled and bewildered. Then he heard Jerry howling nearer, the patter of feet bounding across the yard. The dog leaped through the open door, shaking itself and tumbling at his feet. "There, Jerry, there, Jerry," he crooned, bending over to pat the collie. His hand came away wet with snow slush, and then it dawned on him that the animals too had been frightened by the weird downfall. There was nothing much that he could do until the snow ceased coming down. He contented himself with walking among the horses, talking to them and patting them quietly. After a while, they became a little less excited. About 7 o'clock, the red snow was over. The horses were still nervous, but gradually ended their crazy bucking and whinnying. Lars decided it was safe to leave them and walked back to the farmhouse, mopping his brow. The thing in the field. Over bacon and eggs and steaming coffee, Lars and Helga discussed the phenomenon. But with these homely breakfast items before them and a pleasant warm feeling inside, the strange snow began to seem less mysterious. "No wonder the pigs and horses were scared," said Lars, half in jest. "I guess anybody'd feel funny to see red snow, 'stead of white. But it ain't anything to worry about. It's probably just dust in the air like I said." "Maybe so," Helga answered doubtfully. "But where's there any red dust around here?" The question stumped Lars. He knew Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Nebraska, and Iowa, but in none of these states and in none of several others that he had some acquaintance with was there anything with the peculiar color of the snow. "I wish you'd stay around here today," Helga continued slowly. "I don't feel right somehow. Things ain't natural like they ought to be." "No need to worry," he answered briefly. "Everything's all right." As if in mockery of his words, the whole house shook, the coffee slopped across the table, and a terrific crash burst on their ears from nearby. Without a word, Lars made another run for the door. Helga, with superstitious fear clutching heavy at her heart, remained behind to straighten up the table. Intuition or instinct warned her that something was wrong with the world. The red snow. And now this explosive crash. What could they mean? She heard Lars and Jerry walking around, as they searched for the cause of the disturbance. But when Lars re-entered the house 10 minutes later, the frown on his face showed the failure of his efforts. "What was it?" she perfunctorily asked. "Nothing that I could find," he replied, obviously puzzled and irritated. "Sounded like a tree or something fell on the barn, but there wasn't anything the matter. I guess maybe we're hearing things." It was poor comfort. The two finished breakfast in silence. At its conclusion, Lars remarked briefly, "I'm going up to the 40 acres to see how the ground's coming along. I'll be back in 15 or 20 minutes. If you need me, shout, and I'll hear you." Helga made no answer in spite of her fears. She knew the futility of argument with her stubborn husband. Lars called Jerry and the two set off. The sun was up, and the sky fairly clear. It was getting warmer. The red snow already looked soggy, and the air had a bad smell, malodorous and stale. A path led from the rear of the farmhouse past the chicken coops and barn, cut across the hog run, then ran through an open field and finally up a small hill, on the other side of which lay the 40 acres, a tract used for wheat. Lars walked down it past the barn and across the hog run. As he started to continue over the open field, Jerry suddenly bristled. Lars heard the collie growl savagely. He looked around, but nothing unusual was in sight. "Come on, Jerry," he called, and walked on. The dog lagged behind, growling and whining. Then Lars abruptly stopped in surprise. 10 yards or so ahead of him was a great gash in the wet earth. It must have been freshly made, for the soil bulged around its edges, and no pool of water had as yet formed in it. When Lars strode forward after his momentary pause, Jerry set up a furious barking that ended in a long, whining howl, and refused to advance an inch further. "Stop that fool barking and come along," he swore irritably. His nerves were getting frayed, but the dog absolutely would not obey, and he went on, thinking that the collie would follow if he took the lead. Lars was a few feet from the edge of the deep gash when something he had not seen caught his ankle, and he tripped forward. In one mad second of horror, the pit of hell seemed to open up beneath him. Something else he could not see hit him a great blow on his forehead, and his outstretched arms were bruised on a hard substance. He was leaning forward at a 45-degree angle over the mysterious depression. He looked straight down and saw its bottom a dozen feet below, but he did not fall. He might have been leaning on a steel platform or resting against a wall, but there was absolutely nothing in sight. A sudden bubbling of sweat broke out on him. The blood from the bruise on his forehead dripped down, but hung suspended in midair a few inches from his face. With terror glazing his eyes, he slowly pushed himself upright and stood trembling for a minute. He put out his hand again, and his fingers felt the same stuff, hard as steel, colder than ice, with knobs here and there, and strange grooves. There was an indentation on the surface that his hand slipped into, and his fingers vanished from sight clear to the wrist. At that, sheer fright gripped him, and he turned and ran with all his strength while Jerry whined at his heels. The terrific crash remained a mystery no longer. Would to God that it had. Something that was never of this earth had fallen in the midst of an open field, whether by accident or purpose. All the old folk myth and witch lore of his race surged into his mind in an instant to increase his panic. But he thought of Helga too, as he ran, and he decided that he would say nothing which might alarm her more. Outside the farmhouse he halted for a minute in order to regain his breath. He was panting heavily and gulped air in. Then he entered the kitchen, trying to act as he normally would. "Is that you, Lars?" Helen called. A little later she walked in from another room. She ran forward when she saw him. "Why, Lars? Your face is bleeding." "Yes, I tripped and fell on a stone." Helga looked into his eyes that were still wild and dilated, and the truth of intuition flashed into her heart. "Lars, the crash, you know what it was. There was something in the field." "No," he answered deliberately. "There was nothing in the field. The falling that was upward. It was a solemn pair that sat down at midday for lunch. The oppressive weight of mystery and fear hung over the table and stopped even the small talk that they ordinarily indulged in. By tacit consent, they said nothing further about the ominous incidents of the morning. Towards 2 o'clock, the sky began to cloud up, and it grew cooler outside. But the red snow had all melted in the warmth of late morning, and around the farmhouse hung a putrid smell, stale and nauseating, the odor of a charnel house or of the grave. Lars puttered away in the kitchen and basement, doing odd jobs to pass time. He did not leave the house. His nerves were on the ragged edge, and he did not know what might happen next. The red snow and the thing in the field lay heavy on his heart. Nature had gone all askew this day, and the security and trust of a lifetime had vanished in a brief hour. What could he do in the presence of mystery that he could not explain or account for, and things that went against the laws of life he relied on? As the great masses of leaden clouds piled overhead, and gusts of chill wind hooted around the yard and the house, an indefinable persistent terror of the unknown hung over his thoughts. He had only one ray of hope, that the paper which the rural postman would leave in mid-afternoon would contain some explanation of the unnatural snowfall. The thing in the field he vainly tried to put out of mind by pretending that it must be a new kind of comet. It was about 4 o'clock when Lars, at that time fixing a broken window sash upstairs, heard the postman's whistle. Laying aside hammer and nails, he walked down a short hallway to the head of the stairs. From this point, looking across a front bedroom and out its window, he could see his mailbox on its post where the county road ran by some 90 or 100 yards away. There the familiar horse and buggy of the postman were halted, and to his surprise, Helga with the mail in her hand was there too, talking with him. But on the point of returning to the house, she must have seen him coming down the road and gone out to meet him. The sight of Helga made Lars curiously uneasy. He wished she had waited to let him go after the mail. As he began to descend the flight of steps, he decided that he would ask her to remain inside for the next day or so. But all thoughts were driven from his head and black panic overwhelmed him with a sickening rush when he was halfway down. For there came to his ears a sound that was yet many sounds. There was a thin, high zing-gee-gee, the mad whinny of a horse, and the sudden, piercing shriek of a woman. And then there came again that long, strange zing-gee-gee, and the noise of a great wind. In one leap Lars cleared the rest of the stairs and stumbled on a twisted ankle through the parlor and to the front door and so outside. And the blind fear he had felt as he hung over a pit that morning, suspended by that which he could not see, was as nothing to the surge of horror that froze him now. For there was no one in sight. The post box was deserted. The road stretched away to the left, bare of any human traveler for its 3/4 of a mile to the next curve, and to the right, just as empty for a half-mile. In the field that lay beyond the road, not a living creature was to be seen. Helga and the postman and the horse and buggy had vanished as suddenly, as unexplainably as though they had never been. But there was one curious change in the scene. Everything was grey from the clouds that obscured the sky, except for a round patch of sunlight, perhaps 100 yards in diameter, in the vicinity of the mailbox. Lars mechanically looked upward. High above him was a single rift in the cloud banks, a rift that the rolling clouds had already partially closed. Even as he looked, he saw some white objects flutter down to earth. They were letters and papers. He picked up a handful like one dazed or mad and stumbled back into the house. He was hardly conscious of a sudden roar of wind that arose, or the wall of sleet that drove out of the clouds in a wild slant. And in the same mechanical, irresponsible way, he turned again and emerged into half-darkness with the hopeless hope that his eyes and ears had tricked him. He walked along the road to the left, then to the right, searched the field beyond it, called and shouted till his voice was hoarse. But not a thing did he find, and no one answered his cries. Then at last, when the sleet turned to a fine drizzle which itself finally ended, he retraced his steps to the farmhouse. He was vaguely aware of a throbbing pain in his ankle, but a numbing daze possessed him still. The letters were lying where he had dropped them. From the scattered heap, he automatically selected the paper that he had thought might contain an explanation or comment concerning the red snow. But he could not concentrate his thoughts, and they were only disjointed phrases that his eye picked out here and there. Red snow falls, possibly volcanic ash in upper atmosphere, dust clouds from western prairies, unknown organism puzzles scientists. Chemist asserts he found traces of a substance like blood were the fragments that ran in a jumble through his head, and somewhere else on the page, a few other phrases. Strange display of northern lights witnessed last night, beams of red, green, violet, and yellow. Phenomenon localized over Norton, university astronomer, offers no explanation. Something from above. By nightfall of that day of madness, the atmosphere was fairly clear once more. In the east still hung a low bank of clouds, but overhead and westward, the stars were coming out. Lars was seated by a window looking dully into the night, as he had sat for the last 3 hours. His mind had become more lucid as he brooded over mysteries he could not fathom, but there was a light in his eyes that had never been there before. Only the stolidity of his race had so far kept him from going mad. In his ears that medley of sounds rang yet, and his horrified gaze seemed to be forever fastened on the vacant roadway and the letters fluttering down. It was incredible, unthinkable, but his thoughts always came to the conclusion that was no explanation at all. Somehow, the postman, the horse and carriage, and Helga had been whirled off the surface of Earth. Perhaps it had been a tornado, but nothing else was disturbed, and he had seen no telltale hole in the sky. And the theory did not account for that wailing zing-gee-gee. What was it that could reach from the sky down to Earth, all in a second, and vanish instantly with its prey? When he was a child, he had once wondered how he would feel if he saw an apple fall from a tree and sail skywards instead of dropping to Earth. Now he knew that dreadful sensation, the feeling that nature had suddenly gone wrong. He stared into the sky directly above him, where the stars shone bright and cold, vainly hoping that he might draw a solution out of those fathomless depths. Minutes crawled by. The Milky Way blazed out in its mysterious beauty, and the night was quiet with no wind. When it was that he became conscious of something new, he could not say, but in the back of his muddled thoughts, half-forgotten words groped for expression: stars, phenomenon, northern lights, red, green, yellow. Then he knew. Far above him, so faintly and so far that at first he could not be sure, beams of many-colored light stabbed and shot and pulsed across the stars, and it struck him with surprise and something of a new fear growing upon him that nowhere else was the display visible. In the past, he had often watched the aurora borealis creep down from the north, flaming brighter till streamers and cataracts of weird radiance played across all the northern sky. But he had never before seen their appearance confined to so small an area, nor did these flashing beams of violet and green and red seem as remote as the northern lights usually did. It was strange that they occurred in so limited a space, a spot that did not look much larger than a tabletop, though he knew it must be immensely larger out there in space. Sometimes only two beams would dance around each other, sometimes all would be gone. Then a minute later several rays of different colors would leap out against the starry velvet of night. And the most bewildering aspect of the display was the clearness, the straightness of the beams. There was none of the vagueness and change and slow merging into other patterns and colors that were characteristic of the aurora. This resembled more the snapping on and off of giant flashlights. For several minutes Lars looked at the queer lights, with the dullness of a mind dazed by too many shocks. And even as he watched them, he became gradually aware of something yet newer. He seemed to see one or two black specks in the air between him and the lights, like the dancing specks before the eyes of someone who has been struck on the head. And there came to his ears a rush of wind as two objects hurtled furiously past him to smash on the ground. A moment later, he thought he heard a thud down by the road, and another from somewhere afar. But he could not be sure, for he looked at the two things in the farmyard, and his eyes went wide and glary. Like a run-down automaton, he rose and stumbled downstairs out into the chill, quiet night. There was something oddly familiar in that nearest object, and he walked over to it with a faraway buzzing in his ears and a wild swirl of insane fantasies in his mind. He bent over the still form. A scorched odor came to his nostrils. He recognized the poor, broken body of Helga, the hideously white skin. He crooned a word of grief and stooped over to stroke the lifeless clay. And then he snatched his hand away, for it burned like the fire of a furnace. But he knew it was no fire that he touched, nor any heat, but the biting, absolute cold of outer space. As Helga had vanished, in mystery and terror, so had she returned, but the horror for her was over. The night was silent, but that maddening buzz was louder in his ears. Lars shook his head to rid himself of the noise, and his eyes fell upon the second object. For a moment that was as long as eternity, time and space and the world stood still for Lars. No eyes could look unchanged on that slimy blob of amorphous liquid flesh and fungus and ichor, with its loathly tentacles and beaks, its blackness of corruption, its monstrous mixture of all that was obscene in the vegetable and animal kingdoms, and more horrible still, the thing's metallic core like brown quicksilver or living mercury that moved feebly with an appalling parody of life, and in its very center a sickly, rotten bulb of a dead, blind eye that glared foully at Lars with its dying light. The buzzing in his ears swelled to a grating, shrill din. Something snapped, his teeth champed, and the madness was upon him. He muttered crooning endearments to Helga, shrieked blasphemies at the slimy thing from above, burst out into peals of mirthless laughter and rasping sobs. His crazed mind went off on another tangent, and he stopped his muttering and shrieking as suddenly as he had begun. Instead, he chuckled with insane cunning as though he had discovered a way to cheat the enemy. He backed slyly to the farmhouse, was gone for a minute, reappeared with a great armful of kindling wood. He returned and fetched another and another, until a heap of it lay on the ground. He made a rude pyre out of it, except for an armful or two. He dragged the body of Helga on top of it, though his hands burned as if in a white-hot furnace. He ran back, reappeared with a can of kerosene, poured oil on the pyre. He lighted it while tears of madness and grief ran down his face. Then fury entered his heart. He threw the rest of the kindling on the obscene thing and drenched it with kerosene. As the flames flared up, he danced around with grief and hatred and insanity alternately writhing across his features. He ran to the woodshed for more fuel. He was about to return with another load of cordwood when he heard the roar of a small explosion and saw a fountain of sparks and burning chunks momentarily spew H into air. He stood agape for a second, let his burden drop, then ran madly to his fires. The obscene monstrosity was no more. Something in it, or something it carried, had exploded. Burning embers glowed and smoldered in 2 or 3 places on the farmhouse roof. But Lars paid no attention to them, or to the flames that were beginning to lick at the eaves, for a half-forgotten thought was pounding through his head. The thing in the field. The thing in the field. Like a chant, the phrase sang in his mind, and another wild peal of maniacal laughter burst from his lips. He scarcely looked at the black smoke that surged off Helga's funeral pyre, or the flames that consumed, as he turned and sped back to the woodpile. He picked up all he could carry of 3-foot lengths and stumbled down the path, staggering under their weight. When he reached the gash in earth, faintly illuminated by a red glare that began to come from the burning roof, he tossed his entire armful of wood onto the invisible thing and shouted madly again as it hung suspended in air. He made trip after trip until fuel was strewn all around and over the thing that could not be seen. On his last return, he brought 2 one-gallon cans of kerosene, which he tossed to the middle of the pile after partly emptying them on as much wood as was within reach, and lighted a match. A tongue of fire leaped forth and raced over the pile, and a volume of thick, oily smoke issued up. Everything was bright with a lurid glare from the farmhouse that was now entirely ablaze. Like a necromancer uttering his ritual of incantation and dark sorcery, Lars leaped and danced and howled around the great bonfire he had built. A tower of black smoke from the kerosene mounted almost straight upwards. The wood crackled. The heat became scorching and blistering. Under the metamorphosis of fire, a last strange riddle was seen by Lars to take shape before his eyes. There were outlines forming, the suggestion of a vast structure embedded deeply in earth. He gibbered to the stars as he saw planes and angles and cubes that looked like spheres and the geometry of another dimension. His maniacal laughter rang out again as he looked through glowing, transparent walls and saw objects he could not name, strangely mounted mechanical devices, fantastic articles that no mind on earth could have imagined or shaped, and lying around them were dozens of those slimy things that were neither animal nor vegetable nor mineral, but partook loathsomely of the nature of all three. He shouted in mirthless glee when he briefly glimpsed still other things, weird, gaseous substances on the floor that held their shape as rigidly as dead bodies. There came a hiss, like a great sigh, a rumble of warning, and Lars insanely flung his arms wide apart as if to embrace the cleansing fire. It was his last gesture, for earth and sky and life trembled and were blasted before a titanic explosion that wiped out the thing in the field. A riddle of the stars. On the afternoon of March 31, shortly after 2 p.m., Larry Green took off from the Twin Cities flying field with a special consignment of bank dispatches for Seattle. His plane was last seen at Elk Forks, 20 miles east of Norton, at approximately 4 o'clock. When nothing more was seen of him and no report from him or about him received, the importance of his cargo caused a searching party to be sent out. Early in the morning of April 1, his airplane, completely wrecked, was found near the burned Lohberg farmhouse, but the pilot was missing. The searching party continued to scour the area. A couple of hours later, the flyer was discovered wandering in a dazed condition through a field near Norton. His account of what had happened was so singular and fantastic that his sanity was questioned. When, however, he was seen to be suffering severely from exposure, he was immediately rushed to the Twin Cities for medical attention. All efforts to save his life were unavailing. He died of gangrenous infection several days after his admission to Miller Hospital. Among his effects were found 2 significant items, a black object, and the following extraordinary communication, which was apparently written some time during the first day of his confinement. To others, I leave the task of deciding whether I have been the victim of insanity or hallucination. Already I myself doubt the testimony of my own eyes and ears. If it were not for the disc which I brought with me, I would believe that the entire adventure was a delusion or a dream. But unless the disc proves to be a figment of a deranged imagination, I cannot doubt the truth of what I have to say and the reality of what I saw. At 2:10 p.m. on March 311, took off from the Twin Cities flying field with a bundle of bank dispatches for Seattle. I headed due west. Weather conditions were fair for the first hour, and I kept at a relatively low flying level of 2,000 feet altitude. At this point, somewhat less than 100 miles from the Twin Cities, I was nearing a region for which sleet or snowstorms were forecast. Cloud banks were piling up ahead, so I immediately began to climb for more altitude. The last town I saw was Elk Forks. After that, the clouds below me obscured everything. I had climbed to 6,000 feet, then 7,500, and was now keeping to an altitude of 9,000 feet. I estimated that I must be nearing Norton, which should have been my next landmark, if I could see it. Without the slightest warning, the incredible happened. My plane was suddenly enveloped in a greenish light. The motor and propeller droned, but my progress was at a complete standstill. My altimeter showed 11, 13, 15,000 feet so rapidly that I could hardly follow it. Nothing I could do or did had any effect on the plane or its phenomenal rise. The sensation was sickening. I had the motor wide open, but not a foot did we advance. Instead, the plane rose straight up like a balloon. I scarcely had time even to adjust my oxygen tank and turn on the current for the airtight electrically heated suit that I always wear in cold weather. Flying. This action probably saved my life. The altimeter soared to 40,000 feet, then froze. Everything had happened so instantly that I was almost stunned. A few seconds at most could have elapsed between the moment the greenish light came and the moment the altimeter froze. Through my suit, heated though it was, I now began to feel an intense cold. I had no knowledge of how high I was, but I knew that if my strange ascent were not quickly halted, I would perish in the absolute or almost absolute zero of the upper atmosphere. The motor itself now froze and went dead. Instead of falling, the airplane remained in its unnatural suspension, still bathed in green light. The sky above me had become so dark that I was certain I must be near the outer edge of Earth's atmospheric blanket. The cold was more piercing than ever. My goggles became filmed with ice. I could no longer see. I did not know what had happened. I began to resign myself to death as numbness crept over me. The source of the mysterious green light seemed to be above me, but I could not account for it. At this moment, I thought I heard 2 faint clicks, closely following each other. A few seconds later, they were repeated. I rubbed the ice film off my goggles. The green light had disappeared. Overhead, the stars had gone out. The effect was precisely as if I was looking through an invisible pane of glass, but could see nothing. Only a few feet from my plane had suddenly appeared the bodies of a dead man and woman. So far as I was able to judge, my ascent had come to an end. The intense cold rapidly lessened in severity, but had it been 1,000 times as icy as it was, it could not have been more numbing than the strange horror of all that had happened to me in a brief minute. I was in the midst of a hellish nightmare, infinitely more titanic and brain-shattering than any I have ever had. The nauseating terror and fear of mystery were upon me. I hardly knew whether I was dreaming or awake, alive or already beyond the borderland of death. And those 2 corpses hanging in the air near me, their appearance was as ghastly as it was inexplicable. The whole thing was like a delirious vision. I felt as if I were confined in a room. The terrific cold had ceased, yet there was not a star in the sky above me, nor could I see the earth beneath. If it were not for the airplane and the 2 bodies in plain view, I would have believed that I had gone blind. I had hardly understood or rather, realized my situation, since I did not understand it at all, when there came to my ears again a faint click from above, and I automatically looked up. I do not know what I expected to see, except anything or nothing. But it was no answer to any of the questions in my mind that I saw, but mystery deeper and deeper. There was a cloud vapor a dozen feet above me, or was there. I have never before seen a gaseous substance hold its form and shape rigidly, but I did then, and with a sick, faint feeling, I realized that the cloud-like thing was alive. I had an impression of eyes burning into mine, but there were no eyes visible. My brain received a command, but my ears heard no sound. In some way that I could not comprehend, the monstrous living substance above me had put into my thoughts a picture of myself climbing from the cockpit and ascending. Climb from the cockpit of an airplane, heaven knows how many miles from Earth, with slight chance that any parachute could save me in so great a fall. And yet what else was there to do? It was madness, suicide. I fought with all my strength to retain my seat, but I was powerless before the unheard, imperative command, and slowly I climbed over the side into empty space. I ought to have fallen, down, down, like a dead weight, according to physical laws. But I was standing as upright as though solid ground was beneath my feet. Where was the ultimate cold that should be freezing me? Why did I not fall? What was the meaning of all the eerie events of the past few minutes? I was trembling violently. Hot and cold sweat broke out on me. A deadly fear gnawed at my heart for the first time in my life. Then I thought that I must have entered some queer, hypnotic state, for a sudden feeling of peace came over me, and in answer to another silent command or mind picture, I mounted what appeared to be a short ladder. I can never convey that utterly dreadful sensation of climbing rungs that had no visible existence through sheer space miles off the Earth. After some moments, I stepped sidewise as I was directed, and found myself on another invisible floor. The gaseous thing retreated as I advanced, and now hung inanimate a few yards away from me. But I scarcely noticed it, for my eyes were bewildered by the sight around me, and a dim light of comprehension began to clear away the fog over my thoughts. Masses of intricate, gleaming machinery and delicate mechanism were everywhere, together with elaborate dials, controls, and other devices whose purpose I could not even conjecture. Around each device and control were grouped scores of the gaseous things. I dreamed for a moment that I was in an airship of some new kind, but there were no enclosing walls, and I could see no floor beneath me. And yet the sky was devoid of light or stars. All this I noticed in a brief instant, before my captor mutely commanded me to walk forward a few paces and seat myself. Too stunned and overwhelmed to offer any resistance, I did as I was ordered. The thing drifted toward me and hung a few feet away. I looked at it, and again I had an impression of burning eyes that I could not see. But there came over me anew that odd sensation of peace. How can I describe the strangeness and creepy fascination and even terror of the scene, or what followed? Surely no man was ever before so suddenly jerked from the habits and thoughts of a lifetime as I was then. Without realizing it until afterward, I must have been placed again under hypnotic or mental control, for the mechanism and gaseous shapes surrounding me suddenly faded away into blankness. And while I had the disembodied feeling of one who dreams, a succession of fantastic images and pictures were imposed on my imagination by the thing before me. No word passed between us, for neither could have understood the other's language. By a kind of mesmeric thought transference, I was made to understand all that had happened to me, and some things I had not known about, and some of which I will probably never have any further knowledge to certify their truth, or validate the reality of my experience. And this is the narrative that was conveyed to me under such extraordinary circumstances and bizarre surroundings. As I had begun to suspect, I was in a space flyer of utterly new type and construction. The being who hung a short distance away was Relulpa, director of an expedition from Saturn on a mission that meant existence or death to the solar system. For thousands on thousands of years, civilization had been progressing on Saturn until the inhabitants were now as far in advance of us as we are of jungle apes. The life force, which is persistent everywhere, in an infinite variety of organisms produced on Saturn opaque, gaseous substances like relopa. Many years before our meeting, these eerie inhabitants of another world had discovered deep in the bowels of their planet one of the rarest elements in all the universe, an element that would need to be designated, I suppose, as number 93 on our own scale, which comprises only 92. Saturn itself contained no more than a few thousand tons of the ore from which this element, named seglin by them, was extracted. Seglin resists cold, even to absolute zero, but if exposed to sufficient heat, it explodes. Its most curious and most valuable property is its imperviousness to gravitation. For instance, a lump of the pure element, isolated under an open sky, would immediately be hurled skyward by the centrifugal force of the spinning planet, since gravitation has no effect upon it, until it finally breaks up into atomic particles. If it ever does, it will hurtle forever through the universe, rebounding anew from any gravitational attraction within whose range it may chance to approach. In extracting the element, and in experimenting with it, the Saturnians not only discovered how to control it, but obtained byproducts of inestimable value. Seglin is completely transparent, but nothing beyond it is visible, as if you looked through a pane of glass, but could see nothing on the other side. Perhaps I can make this clearer by saying that it is like a blind spot. If you put 2 dots on a piece of cardboard, hold the cardboard at arm's length, focus your gaze on one dot, and then gradually draw the cardboard toward you, one of the dots will disappear when the cardboard is a foot or so from your eyes. Well, seglin acts like a blind spot at any distance from the eye of the beholder. Furthermore, the Saturnians found that the last impurity removed had the effect of counteracting the element. That is, until this impurity was taken out, seglin was held by gravitational attraction. Thus, by restoring the impurity, or by coating seglin with it, the element would again be subject to gravity and possess only normal mineral characteristics. There was no more than a limited amount of the stuff on Saturn, and no trace of it had ever been found in the spectrum of any star. What should be done with it? The Saturnians considered every possible use, and finally decided that it would be most valuable as an offense against any danger. And so they built this vast space flyer, and armed it with all their weapons and rays of destruction. The flyer could not be seen, nor its location guessed, unless it crossed a star when it would shut out the light behind. On the flyer's exterior at one tip were placed scores of thin plates of the impurity. These were controlled by radio from inside the ship. They could be adjusted to any position so that the speed could be regulated and just enough gravitational pull shut off or turned on to let the ship rise and land safely. With this aircraft, the Saturnians had explored the solar system hundreds of years ago and had even ventured into the galaxy beyond, for there was apparently no limit to the speed which it could attain. If its rate was constant when it left the gravitational influence of Saturn, it would keep on flying at that rate. But if its speed was constantly increasing at the point where it passed beyond Saturn's influence, its acceleration would continue at the same proportion, and if it were worth the risk, a speed of hundreds or thousands of light-years per second could be reached. After their early experiments and explorations, the Saturnians kept the flyer idle, but always in readiness for any danger. They had discovered many disquieting matters on their trips, but so long as nothing happened, they preserved their policy of waiting in readiness. And out of night, with no warning, had suddenly come the one cataclysmic danger that they had not anticipated. From their great central observatory, the Saturnians regularly surveyed the heavens for astronomic and protective reasons. One week the observation had shown a normal view of the region of the evening star, and the next week, stars were disappearing momentarily in a straight line, an extension of which would terminate in the solar system. They did not want to believe the explanation, but there was only one explanation possible. Some star or world beyond the reach of their most powerful telescope had possessed a rare ore, and even now a spaceship constructed of seglin, whether a scouting party or an expedition of invaders, was hourly leaping colossal stellar distances toward the solar system. Their surprise turned almost into panic when they discovered by further observation that instead of one there were 3 space flyers hurtling onward. So short was the warning that desperate measures had to be taken. Hasty calculations showed that the invaders were heading toward Earth first, perhaps to reconnoiter, or possibly to use Earth as a ricochet for reaching Saturn. Rilauper was summoned to lead a counter-expedition. There was desperate need of reaching Earth, before or not later than the invaders. It could not be accomplished even with the normal acceleration of the Saturnian spaceflyer. In this crisis, at the moment when the nullifying plates were stripped from the flyer's exterior, the most powerful explosive known to them was detonated. A blinding flash followed the aircraft as it was hurled skyward with the initial acceleration required. Over Earth, the two parties met, and before the invaders realized that their coming was known, the red annihilation ray of the Saturn flyer stabbed out, and the first ship from outside dissolved into brownish dust that drifted slowly downwards. The red ray blazed forth again in a sweeping arc, but missed its goal, for the second ship, which like its comrades used some means other than black plates of regulating gravitational attraction, had suddenly dropped in order to escape the deadly ray, but the ship following it had also dived and crashed into the rear of its own companion, and as the bitter cold of space mowed down its occupants, the second ship spun out of control and fell hurtling to Earth. Some of its occupants were spilled into vacancy. The green magnetic ray of the Saturn flyer instantly flashed across the gulf and caught one of the victims. From him, or from it, the story of the invaders and the purpose of their raid was discovered. Where they came from is unknown, for their world lies beyond any galaxy or nebula known to astronomers of our solar system. But those things from outside the charted universe had found Seglin on their planet, and had found it at the last moment, for their world was dying and had almost reached extinction. With their super telescopes, they had discovered already traces of Seglin in the spectrum of Saturn, long before the element was isolated on their own globe. Time was priceless to those gruesome plant, animal, mineral creatures from the spaces beyond. They had built 3 ships, but these were not sufficient to transport all the inhabitants to another world before the end came. If they could obtain the Seglin ore on Saturn and build 2 more carriers or even 1 great flyer, they would save their entire population. And so the 3 spacehounds leaped away, each loaded with 1,000 of the loathly creatures. One was to land on the most habitable of solar planets and most favorable for their purpose, Earth, there to wipe out all life with the violet ray of terrific heat and the yellow ray that blasted anything it touched. The other 2 were to disgorge on Saturn, and while one band destroyed whatever life might be there, the other would extract Seglin from the ore and construct as many ships as possible. Immediately after the 3 original ether planes had landed, they were to return to their world, empty except for the crews that manned them, in order to bring back other thousands of obscene, loathsome things, and their hellish plan would have succeeded to perfection if they had not made one disastrous mistake. They had not known what life existed, or whether any life existed on Saturn. They had thought that the Saturnians were unaware of the properties of Seglin in any case, and that the ore was still unmined, or that, if worst came to worst, their own 3 warcraft would prove to be invincible. And so, completely unprepared for a sudden counter-onslaught, the strength of the invaders was cut down by 2/3 in the very moment of their triumph, as they had almost achieved their destination. But now the 3rd ship was warned, and all this day the Saturn machine had been engaged with it in a struggle on whose outcome the fate of worlds depended. If the Saturnians were defeated, Earth and Saturn were doomed, even though the invaders should find themselves unable to save all the inhabitants of their own world by transporting them across the void. Rilauper showed me a large, metallic disk, on the surface of which the heavens were mirrored. Since nothing outside could be seen by anyone within a Seglin plane, television was necessarily employed for guidance and piloting. On this disk, not far from the center which indicated our position, I saw stars blotted out where the invaders hung in watchful readiness for instant maneuvering. The astounding mental picture story had come to its conclusion. At once queries I had been forming sprang to my thoughts. What can I do? Why do you want me? Were the 2 silent questions that I asked Rilauper, and the answer came back. There was nothing that I could do up here. Rilauper had sighted my airplane and ordered it picked up by the green ray. He had told me all he knew concerning the danger in order that I might warn the people of my world. For Earth would be the first victim in the event that the Saturnians were defeated. I was now about to be released. But I objected that it would be fatal to try using my airplane at this height, and my parachute would probably be ripped from my shoulders with the force and speed of my fall when it finally opened. As soon as he read my thoughts, Rilopa gave me a curious black disc, and again my mental image informed me how to use it. Suddenly he flashed me the image that the final, desperate battle was near. At the same instant, he thrust me toward the outer chamber through which I had originally entered. I had no willpower of my own beside this mental giant. I merely followed his directions. I saw his strange, cloud-like form for the last time. I felt him wish me good luck, as I in turn wished him success. And then the door clicked behind me. I held the disc over my head, manipulating it as Rilopa had explained, so that parts of the black covering slid off the seglin. I heard another click, and then all at once I dropped. My airplane twisted past me, hurtling downward, and after it shot the bodies of the two people who had been on Earth, in the path of the green ray, when its magnetic power caught and swept up my plane. As I fell slowly, still feeling as if I had dreamed a horrible nightmare, I looked above me to assure myself that it had all been true, and my eyes went wide when I saw red and green ray flashing against yellow and violet beam. Surely that fierce, unique battle, whose importance could not be overestimated, was the most cosmic ever witnessed by man. Sometimes all four rays darted and flamed out wickedly. Sometimes only one or two, or both rays of one flyer, would vanish only to reappear suddenly in another spot. I heard the wind whistle past me. I looked at Earth far below, and a great fear took hold of me. But I was falling no faster than I would have been with a parachute, and the mental picture of Rilopa with his promise of safety came back to reassure me. Once more I looked upward, before frozen vapor as once previously congealed on my goggles and obscured vision. I saw only the red and the green rays leaping madly across the sky in a paean of victory. The battle was won. The doctor tells me that gangrene has set in. I guess I was more seriously frozen than I thought in those upper spaces. They think I'm crazy and they wouldn't believe what I tried to tell them last night. Maybe I am crazy, but I swear that I saw all the things I have written of as plainly as I now see my hospital cot, or the skylight above me, or the black disc under my pillow. Well, that ought to convince them, if nothing else will. Larry Green. The black disc. Underneath the pillow of the cot on which Larry Green had died, a small disc was found. The nurse who discovered it looked at it in some curiosity, puzzled as to its purpose and wondering what disposal to make of the article. She finally summoned the doctor, who had vainly tried to save the pilot's life. "What is it?" he brusquely inquired. "That's just it. I don't know," she answered. "I found this on Mr. Green's cot. What shall I do with it?" The doctor took the object and scrutinized it closely. It was a black disc, slightly oval in shape, and approximately a foot in diameter. It was perfectly flat, with an unvarying thickness of a half-inch. On two sides it was indented, and at each indentation was a row of tiny knobs. The doctor mused. "I've never before seen anything quite like it." He fingered the knobs meditatively. There was a faint click, and the black covering of the disc slid off or collapsed somehow. All at once, he found himself with nothing whatever in his hands. He heard a sudden wind, the crash of shattered glass, a sound like the rush of air. A dumbfounded doctor looked at an amazed nurse as bits of glass from a broken skylight tinkled around them. The black disc, which they had been examining a few seconds ago, had vanished. End of Something from Above by Donald Wandrei. This is the end of the story. Tell us what you think in the comment section. Please subscribe and ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we release new content. If you want to support us, consider joining our channel membership. You will get instant early access to more than 100 stories before their release. This is the only way to support our channel.